It started like any other day in court. Reporters yawning, lawyers flipping through binders, the usual shuffle of a high-profile celebrity trial dragging into its 12th day. But then, without warning, he walked in. Keanu Reeves. The room shifted. The jury leaned forward. Even Diddy froze for a split second, as if he'd seen a ghost from the past walk straight into his reckoning. And then came the line that dropped like a hammer on marble floors. He asked me to bathe in his used bathwater. The courtroom didn't breathe. Not a single cough, shuffle, or click of a pen. Just silence. People assumed Keanu Reeves, the man known for humility, for avoiding drama, for quietly donating millions behind the scenes, had nothing to do with the darker side of Hollywood. But that image shattered in seconds, because this wasn't just some tabloid rumor. This was testimony, under oath, in front of a federal judge. And Keanu didn't flinch. His voice was calm, but his eyes carried the weight of something deeper, something he'd buried for years. And as he stood there, revealing the bizarre and humiliating encounter he had with Sean Diddy Combs, everyone realized this wasn't going to be another quiet day in court. But the real shock? This strange request wasn't about water. It was about power. And what came next proved just how far Diddy's influence and ego really went. You see, most people heard Keanu's statement and immediately got stuck on the bizarre imagery. Bathwater? Really? But that's exactly what Diddy wanted. According to Reeves, the moment wasn't about hygiene, humor, or even humiliation. It was about control, a psychological play disguised as absurdity. Because when you can convince a global superstar to even consider doing something that ridiculous, you've already won. Keanu detailed the moment during his testimony like someone describing a dream that turned into a nightmare. It happened at what he thought was a creative gathering, an intimate dinner at one of Diddy's hidden Hollywood mansions. The kind of place where the air smells like money, secrets, and too much silence. The conversation started casually, talks of music, film, philosophy. But then Diddy leaned in, lowered his voice, and asked the now infamous question, "You ever let go of control so much, you'd bathe in someone else's presence, in their energy?" Keanu laughed at first, thinking it was some weird metaphor or artsy nonsense. But Diddy wasn't joking. He gestured toward a polished marble tub and said, "I just used it. And I'd be honored if you stepped in next." Now think about that for a second. Not because of how wild it sounds, but because of what it means in context. This wasn't a dare. This wasn't a prank. This was Diddy testing boundaries, testing obedience. In a room filled with power, ego, and reputation, he was measuring who would bow and who would walk away. Keanu, he left. Quietly, politely, but clearly shaken. And yet, years later, the moment still lingered in his memory like a thorn. Not just because it was strange, but because it wasn't isolated. This was just one scene from a much larger, more disturbing pattern. And Keanu was about to reveal just how deep that pattern goes. What Keanu said next wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic, but it cut deeper than anything said in that courtroom so far. This wasn't about a bath. It was about seeing if I'd submit. That statement sent chills through the room. Because in just a few words, Reeves had peeled back the Hollywood curtain. And what he exposed wasn't glitter or glamour, it was a psychological game played by the powerful to keep everyone else in line. He explained that Diddy wasn't the only one using bizarre rituals or manipulative tactics. In fact, he wasn't even the most creative. But what set Diddy apart was how blatantly he operated. He didn't bother hiding his dominance plays. He wanted you to know you were under his control. And if you resisted, you were out. Keanu described other moments he'd seen with fellow actors and artists, people being told to prove loyalty in increasingly strange ways. Some were told to give up projects, others were told to show up to private parties wearing things they wouldn't be caught dead in. One director allegedly had to recite lines from a failed script backwards, just to keep his job. At first, people think it's just Hollywood eccentricity, just weird rich people behavior, but Keanu said the longer you stay in that world, the more you realize. It's all a test, a constant silent audition to prove you'll play the game, that you'll never question the script, that you'll keep your mouth shut, even when the lights go off. And those who don't, they don't just get blacklisted, they get erased, quietly, completely. And that's exactly what Keanu feared when he decided to finally speak up. Because his story was one thing, but there were others. Bigger, darker, untold. And some of them, he said, never made it out. Keanu Reeves didn't cry during his testimony. He didn't raise his voice or point fingers. But the weight of what he said next carried more emotion than any outburst ever could. I stayed silent because I didn't want to disappear. Let that sink in. This is a man who's been hailed as the nicest guy in Hollywood, beloved for his humility, his generosity, and his quiet strength. And yet, even Keanu, was afraid. Not of embarrassment, not of cancel culture, but of vanishing without a trace, the way so many others had. He spoke about friends, directors, musicians, even a rising screenwriter who had run-ins with Diddy or others in his circle. After crossing the wrong line, they didn't just lose gigs, they lost their entire careers. Some fell into depression, some moved abroad. One even changed his name and started teaching drama in a small-town school, pretending his past never existed. And what was the common thread? They all said no. No to the parties, no to the requests, no to the whispered instructions that came right before a big opportunity. Just go with it. Don't ask questions, or the infamous, it's part of the process. Keanu looked down when he mentioned that part, almost as if he was ashamed. Not of what he did, but of what he didn't do, of how many times he kept quiet, of how often he convinced himself to ignore the gut feeling just to protect his peace. But peace doesn't last when your silence protects predators. And Keanu made it clear. This testimony wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about canceling Diddy. It was about finally interrupting a cycle. And if that meant losing roles, studios, or public favor, so be it. Because some truths are too heavy to carry alone. And he was done carrying them. As the courtroom hung on every word, Keanu did something most witnesses hadn't dared. He didn't just talk about Diddy. He talked about the circle around him, the enablers, the gatekeepers, the ones who smiled in public but operated in the shadows. He doesn't act alone. He never did. According to Reeves, Diddy's power wasn't just his wealth or fame, it was his network. A carefully curated ecosystem of artists, managers, PR firms, and party planners who understood the rules. You didn't just show up to a Diddy event, you were screened, watched, and tested. Keanu described being invited to a house party where nothing was what it seemed. Every room had cameras, some obvious, some not. Conversations felt scripted. Strangers approached him and offered compliments laced with veiled propositions. He called it a social audition, a place where Diddy played director, audience, and critic, all at once. The drinks, never ending, the music, always curated to set the tone, the vibe, euphoric on the surface, predatory underneath. Keanu never named names in open court, but he mentioned famous faces who watched others squirm in these parties, saying nothing, just sipping champagne as careers twisted and boundaries blurred. Some even took part, not all out of malice. Many, he said, were trapped too deep to leave. It was like a pyramid of silence, Diddy at the top, willing participants below, then the scared, the confused, and finally, the discarded. This wasn't just a toxic friendship circle, it was a machine. One built on secrets, shame, and silence. And Keanu Reeves just threw a wrench in its gears. But if Diddy's inner circle had secrets, the industry itself had far more to lose. And Keanu was only getting started. Keanu leaned forward slightly, his voice lowering, not out of fear, but out of gravity. In Hollywood, there are rules no one writes down, but everyone follows them. He wasn't just talking about contracts or red carpet etiquette. He meant the real rules, the ones whispered in back rooms, learned through experience, and enforced through fear. He explained how fame in Hollywood isn't just about talent, it's about compliance. You don't rise because you're the best actor in the room. You rise because you understand when to keep your head down, when to laugh at the right jokes, and when to walk away from the truth without ever turning around. And if you break those rules, you don't get blacklisted, you get buried in opportunity. Your phone stops ringing, the random delays start. Suddenly, your name's off the shortlist, and a story leaks that your attitude is difficult. Then someone else, usually more obedient, gets your part, your project, your path. Keanu said he saw it happen, over and over, to actors more talented than him, to directors who once led festivals, to female artists who dared to say no when a favor was requested behind closed doors. And while many of them tried to play along at first, it only delayed the inevitable. Because once you know the rules, you can't unknow them. And that's what haunted Keanu most. He admitted he'd walked away from certain projects, not because the scripts were bad, but because the price of playing by the rules felt too high. And yet, no matter how far he ran, those rules always followed. Smiling, friendly, deadly. Because Hollywood doesn't destroy people with a sword, it does it with a handshake. But what happens when someone like Keanu refuses to shake? What happens when one of the industry's most beloved stars finally breaks the code of silence? What came next shook even the jury. If Diddy thought this trial would be just another scandal to survive, Keanu Reeves made sure to correct that illusion, publicly and permanently. The entire courtroom watched as Diddy, normally composed and cocky, leaned back in his seat with a stunned expression. Eyewitnesses described him as stone-faced but twitching. His legal team frantically shuffled papers while whispering to one another, clearly unprepared for this level of exposure. Why? Because Keanu wasn't just testifying, he was connecting the dots. In a move that felt almost cinematic, Keanu began listing similar behaviors he'd seen or heard whispered over the years. Parties that turned into power rituals. Young artists invited to mentorship retreats that ended in psychological manipulation. Friends who tried to leave and suddenly found themselves mired in fake scandals or legal troubles. And at the center of many of those stories, the same faces, the same circles, the same puppet masters. Keanu didn't say Diddy's name every time, but he didn't have to. The implication was crystal clear. Diddy wasn't just guilty of one bizarre moment. He was symptomatic of an entire system, one that Hollywood had protected for far too long. The silence in the room wasn't just shock, it was recognition. You could feel it. Journalists scribbling faster, cameras zooming tighter, even the judge adjusting his robe with a subtle sense of tension. Because in that moment, it wasn't just Diddy on trial. It was the culture, the machine that made men like Diddy feel untouchable. And Keanu, he just lit the fuse. What followed next would turn the courtroom upside down, because the next witness, he didn't come to testify. He came to confirm everything. Just when the tension seemed like it couldn't stretch any further, the courtroom doors opened, and in walked someone no one expected, a former industry executive, face pale, hands clenched, someone who had worked behind the scenes with major record labels and film studios for over 2 decades. Their name wasn't famous, but their fingerprints were on everything. They weren't scheduled to appear. In fact, their identity was being protected under special court permission. But when they took the stand, it was as if the entire room stopped breathing. What Keanu said is just the surface. From that moment on, it was no longer just one man's story. It was a pattern. The witness confirmed that Diddy had a long-standing habit of using psychological games and humiliation rituals, not just for control, but as a kind of initiation into his inner circle. New artists, fresh actors, even investors were allegedly subjected to bizarre requests. Not always sexual, not always illegal, but always dehumanizing. Their goal? To shatter ego, rebuild dependence, and ensure silence. The witness even described an internal list, a so-called compliance log, a way to track who did what, when, and how far they were willing to go. Refused too many requests? Your career hit a wall. Play along? You rose faster than your resume could explain. And the most chilling part? There are tapes, files, insurance policies, and people are scared. Suddenly, Keanu's bathwater story wasn't a standalone shock. It was the key to unlocking a much larger vault of darkness. This wasn't a meltdown, this was maintenance. A carefully run operation meant to keep people in line. The jury looked shaken, Diddy's team looked cornered, and the media, already typing headlines with words like cult, coercion, and cover-up. But even as the courtroom began to absorb what was happening, Keanu stayed quiet, calm, composed, because he knew something the rest of them were just realizing. This wasn't the climax. It was the beginning of the end. Once the surprise witness stepped down, it was as if the entire industry cracked open. Right there in the courtroom, People who had stayed silent for years began reaching out to reporters, lawyers, and social media influencers. Screenshots, emails, private footage, anonymous testimonies. The dominoes were falling. What Keanu triggered wasn't just a viral moment, it was a reckoning. Agents began distancing themselves from certain clients. PR firms scrambled to pull down old party photos. Major networks quietly began reviewing past partnerships. Code 4, we're scared of what's about to come out. Within 24 hours, hashtags like Soir Diddy Exposed, Waja Keanu New, and Ach Hollywood Cleanse were trending worldwide. But more telling than the trends was the silence from many of the big names who used to praise Diddy. The same celebrities who once toasted champagne at his mansion parties were now acting like they'd never met him. One streaming platform reportedly paused a multi-million-dollar documentary about Diddy's rise to greatness. Another canceled a tribute segment for an upcoming award show. And quietly, very quietly, a few celebrities began unfollowing him online. Not because of guilt, but because they could smell what was coming. Accountability. Keanu, meanwhile, didn't bask in the attention. He left court without fanfare. No speech, no press tour, just a simple nod to the cameras before disappearing into a black car. But his impact was irreversible. He had pulled a thread in Hollywood's tightly woven fabric. And now, the entire thing was starting to unravel. One producer even said off-record, "If Keanu's telling the truth, it means we all knew," and did nothing. And that's the real horror, isn't it? Not that monsters exist, but that they were invited in and offered the best seat at the table. Keanu Reeves didn't need to drop names. He didn't need a dramatic outburst or a final mic drop. His truth was quiet, heavy, surgical, and it left the industry bleeding. By the end of the week, 3 more former collaborators had stepped forward. One was a chart-topping musician, another a retired actor, and the third, a former assistant who had vanished from the public eye for nearly a decade. They all had different stories, but the same villain, the same manipulation, the same eerie rituals, the same pressure to play along or pay the price. One said, "It felt like I was selling pieces of my soul for access. And once it was gone, I didn't even recognize myself in the mirror." And here's the part that should chill everyone watching. These weren't just horror stories from a mansion in the hills. They were reflections of a culture. Keanu wasn't trying to take down one man. He was trying to expose a system that rewards silence, punishes truth, and cloaks trauma in designer suits and red carpets. So the real question isn't, what did Diddy do? The real question is, how many others knew? And let him do it anyway, because now that the dam has cracked, the flood of confessions won't stop. More trials are being rumored. More lawsuits are quietly being drafted. And for the first time in a long time, the untouchables in entertainment are feeling the weight of exposure. But as the lights fade and the cameras turn off, one haunting truth remains. Hollywood wasn't built on talent. It was built on silence. And thanks to Keanu Reeves, that silence is finally breaking. But here's the kicker, this isn't just about Diddy. Whispers are already swirling that other A-listers may be next. What if Keanu was just the first to speak? What if the next testimony is even darker? Subscribe, because what's coming next will blow the lid off everything we thought we knew about the entertainment elite.